Well, welcome to our panel, Ecologies in, of, and after the Plantationocene. My name is Gregg Mitman, and I'm a professor of history, medical history, and environmental studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And it's a great pleasure to be chairing today's panel with such an amazing group of scholars whose remarks are sure to invite us into a thoughtful and engaging conversation around the ecologies and economies of plantation landscapes across different historical periods and regions across the globe. And whether we agree or not on the usefulness of the term, the Plantationocene, and I myself have become increasingly doubtful about its usefulness and its epic making and global ambitions, I think we can all agree on the importance of the plantation as a site for the interrogation of industrial ecologies, with their different valuations of human and non-human lives that foreground deeply embedded racial logics and which continue to be reduplicated in the changing ecological regimes of capitalism. And the site of the plantation as a form of agrarian extractivism and exploitation also invites thinking of alternative ecologies and more just futures, dimensions of which I am sure will surface in today's talks and the conversations around them. For those of you that are just joining the conference, each of the panelists will have 10 minutes for opening remarks. I will introduce each of the panelists when it is their turn to speak. And after the presentations are complete, we will invite you as audience members to join the conversation. And you can do so by either using the hand function in the participants reaction panel, or you can also post your questions in the chat board, and I'll try and toggle in between those and bring as many questions as we can within the time allotted. So our first speaker today is Rachel Bezner-Kerr, who is a professor in the Department of Global Development at Cornell University. She does research in Malawi on agriculture and food systems and is a coordinating lead author for the upcoming Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report. So welcome to all, and thank you, Rachel.
Thanks very much, and I'm really honored to be part of this panel with scholars whose work I really admire. And I think it's really been an exciting conference for me in getting me to think about a body of literature that I have been encountering in the last few years and found really evocative and found really useful. And so this gave me a chance to kind of dive in more deeply. So these are just preliminary thoughts, not a coherent argument yet. But as Greg mentioned, I spend a lot of my time doing long-term research in Malawi, and this talk draws from that work, and it's participatory research, and it really uses agroecology as a frame for that research. And so I see this as really looking at the Plantationocene from that frame, from that perspective. And the photograph here is of a young woman she's weeding a millet field and in Malawi, and she is also carrying a child on her back as part of the kind of reproductive care that happens in Malawi. And women do a lot of the farming in Malawi, and there's a long history to why it's more women than men doing farming in Malawi. But importantly as well, from this perspective, the grain finger millet has been long loathed by colonial and post-colonial governments in Malawi, heavily discouraged from being grown. And so that's one of the reasons why I find this, an interesting photograph to begin with. And so I've encountered some really fascinating pieces from the kind of Plantationocene literature. And the quote here is from a paper I read a number of years ago by Catherine McKittrick, where she was talking about the African burial ground in New York City, and really reflecting on the ways in which we need to look to the past and the plantation past in order to build a future that uses decolonial thinking that's predicated on human life. And I found that a really evocative essay for thinking about the work in Malawi, and not only for predicating decolonial thinking and about farming and food systems that's predicated on human life, and that contrasts the ways in which agriculture has been done in plantations in ways that are violent and that dispossess people of their lands and livelihoods, but also that is predicated on life more generally. So the biota, the soil organisms, and the animals and the birds and the insects that are affected by that same plantation logics. And so I am looking to Black feminist scholarship and decolonial scholarship as a way to think about different ways, alternatives to plantation logics, and also think about the kind of knowledge that is suppressed or invisible because of that plantation logic, and ways to resist that plantation logic that we've been hearing about over the last few days. So a little bit about Malawi. It has its own kind of legacy of the plantation. It wasn't a place where there were many plantations. There were some tobacco and tea plantations in central and southern Malawi, which was Nyasa land during the British colonial period. But it really was considered the Cinderella, if you will, of the region, supplying labor to the mines and the plantations in South Africa and the Rhodesian colonies. And the hut tax was the means by which the government forced men largely to migrate to other countries to work on those plantations. And then there were, so that established, as Eugen talked about for Tanzania, Eugen Chung talked about yesterday for Tanzania, it established enduring race, class, and gender differences. And one of those was women playing a very critical role in growing food for families, while men had to migrate to other countries in order to pay the hut tax. But under the post-colonial period, the inequalities in land were exacerbated. The Kumuzu Banda, the dictator for 30 years in Malawi, increased dramatically the amount of land under estates or plantations, particularly tobacco estates, and by seizing land from smallholders. And he also created a dual system where farmers who were growing for smallholder crops had far fewer research and subsidies and extension, but the majority of the funding went to plantation crops, tea, tobacco, and cotton. And neoliberal policies enacted in the 1980s and onwards exacerbated those differences, but with allowing smallholders to grow tobacco, so really promoting tobacco. So you began to see much more class differentiation. And here are this photograph is of what are called tenant farmers, so people who are often coming from other areas where they have less land available and working on smallholder farms as sharecroppers or as landless workers. And so that's part of where you see the kind of lingering impact of plantation agriculture. But alongside that is the kind of dominant narrative that we're familiar with, those of us working in agriculture and food in Africa, for what kind of agriculture should take place in Africa. And that dominant narrative is really promoting a reliance on fossil fuel inputs and capital intensive approaches that are really expert driven and that ignore the political and social dimensions of agriculture and food that lead to hunger. This approach is very emblematic with the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, funded by Bill Gates and others, that really promotes that strategy. And in contrast is an agroecological approach that tries to draw on ecological principles for growing food, and that also turns to farmer knowledge and as experts and as people who can experiment to find the food approach that will, suit the particular context. The dominant narrative really draws on plantation imaginaries in the African context by, as yesterday Tanya Lee talked about, devaluing smallholder farming in order to hold up the benefits of monocropped fields and expert-driven Western knowledge and Western money as the solution for African farming. And here, Bill Gates is chatting with Joyce Banda, the then president of Malawi, who has signed the agreement, the Global Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, where land was freed up for foreign investment in kind of plantation style, export-driven agriculture. And by freeing up, that means taking land away from use by smallholders. And this kind of dominant narrative shows up from extension workers to international development actors as really denigrating African farming knowledge as being backwards and as being illiterate and requiring modern technology to solve problems of hunger and production. And so the work that I've been involved in the last 20 years is really, in contrast to that, looking to farmers to experiment with a range of different practices using participatory methodologies to test what will work under their conditions. And those practices, are in part agronomic practices, diversification, drawing on indigenous crops that have been sort of denigrated and forgotten, but also exchanging with each other, learning from each other, and importantly, looking at the factors that lead to inequities in households that are not just on the field, but really in homes and communities that can lead to food insecurity and malnutrition. And we've found that this strategy has led to improvements in food security and nutrition. And I could provide an empirical basis for that, but I want to end with this quote. In interviews with farmers who are using these methods, they really contrast their approach with plantation logic. So this woman here is saying, anyone who says agroecology is too much work must not be a farmer. You can see my soils with the work I've done to improve it. I'm okay, I'm not suffering. But in addition, I would rather work in my own garden and have my husband working with me than work on someone else's farm and just be paid with a bit of maize flour and have my family suffer. So that's a really contrast between the kind of plantation logic versus the ecological and social approach that draws on their knowledge and their strengthening of the land ecology to have a viable livelihood. And so I draw inspiration from Catherine McKittrick's notion of the plot and Judy Carney and others in plantation agriculture, the plot that enslaved peoples grew their own crops for food consumption, and thinking about the plot, the agroecological plot in Africa as another challenge to the plantation logic in the contemporary period, in terms of whose knowledge counts and what kind of agriculture and food system we want to have in those spaces and places. And if I had time, I could talk about some of the challenges and contradictions. This is a plantation style, not with enforced labor, but with mechanized labor of land that's been taken just near where the area where I'm working by foreign owners, and it's fenced off and preventing people from benefiting from that land locally. All that is going for export agriculture. So certainly not a romantic solution without a lot of struggle. But I think if we look to the decolonial and Plantationocene literature, it can help to inspire alternatives to that plantation logics in Africa. So that's where I'll stop.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. Our next speaker is Julie Guthman, who is a professor of social sciences at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and is currently heading up the University of California After Project, a multi-campus collaboration investigating the imaginaries, rationales, and effects of Silicon Valley's recent forays into food and agriculture. So welcome, Julie.
Julie, you're muted.
Oops, sorry. Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. And I want to thank Wendy in particular, not only for organizing this fabulous workshop, but for sharing her outstanding article as a provocation. So her article raises two issues in particular that I've been thinking about through both my current research on Silicon Valley and its work in ag and food technology, but also my relatively recent research on California's strawberry industry. Oops, excuse me. So I'm going to devote most of my time to the first issue I want to discuss, which is what happens in the aftermath of the plantation, or as it recedes, as Wendy puts it. But I also want to weigh in a bit on the veritable tension between those who are emphasizing the ecological conditions of the plantation and those who emphasize its racial origins and consequences. So I'll begin with plantation's aftermath, really building on some of the discussion from the last panel. So Wendy ends her paper with this. She writes, if plantations are large-scale, capital-intensive, agro-industrial extractive production sites dependent on forced, usually racialized labor, then alternatives might logically be small-scale, labor-intensive, participatory, and diverse. So my latest research studies those who have a pretty different idea about that. And through their signature language of disruptive innovation, the signature of Silicon Valley, of course, they claim to want to undermine both big ag and big ag incumbents and industrial ag practices. Now, putting aside that many in this space, as they call it, are actually hoping to be acquired by incumbent corporations, many food tech entrepreneurs and the venture capitalists that fund them do indeed promote food futures that are putatively distinct from plantations. And here I'm going to add CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations. So based on their self-representations and products in the making, theirs is a vision of food, especially protein, made via cellular and acellular technologies with microorganisms and bioreactors, robots and professionalized technical labor, and indoor vertical farming. And they do this all in the name of feeding the coming 10 billion, combating climate change, and achieving what they have decided is environmental sustainability. In other words, they are moving beyond the signature characteristics of the plantation, or they imagine they are. Land extensiveness, arduous and coerced field labor, and in the case of alternative protein, enslavement of animals, a term that's routinely used in this space. It's not that they completely reject bioindustrialization. Indeed, the premise of the entire approach, what promises to make food cheap and abundant, is complete detachment from the temporalities and habitats, so to allow continuous production to take place in confined, presumably riskless spaces. Here, the bioreactor instead of the CAFO or plantation. Now, it's pretty clear that their self-representations can be deceptive. Indeed, many of the products being developed will greatly depend on plantations. The now famous Impossible and Beyond burgers are produced in labs, of course, but their key ingredients are peas and soy. And the promoters of these products are nearly silent about where those legumes will come from and under what conditions they will be grown once they reach the scale to which the sector is aspiring to reach. And they're also quite silent about where all those bioreactors would go in space. In other words, if there's a vision of land intensiveness, rather extensiveness, where would those bioreactors be? And I should add that many of the technologies coming through Silicon Valley do not even pretend to disrupt the plantation. A great deal in the so-called ag tech space aims to make plantations even more efficient, or that's what they think they're doing, using precision technologies, drones, digitalization, and so forth, as if efficiency speaks for itself, or as if, as it's already been suggested in this conference, that plantations are indeed more efficient. Now, clearly what's interesting here is these imagined post-plantation futures are not reparative, either for labor or for land. Justified by observations of a current labor shortage in food and agriculture, theirs is a vision of a near laborless world, made possible through robotics and through the vitalism of the microorganism, which, as Melinda Cooper has argued, appears to infinitely produce value rather than the value produced by working humans. So the only work they imagine is for the engineers and biologists and professionals, and at best they nod to the professionalization of the farming population through the introduction of fancy gadgets. So they are nearly silent on what will happen to the primarily brown, in the United States, the primarily brown people and Black people that work in agriculture and food production they seek to disrupt. It's as if addressing the indignity of work in plantations and CAFOs is best done by eradicating labor rather than repairing it or reimagining labor. And they also have no particular idea of what will happen to the land that will be freed after being subject to, after having been subject to plantation regimes. I mean, at times you hear nods to this kind of eco-modernist notion that by bringing land into contained spaces, the rest will somehow revert to wild nature. But I don't think, we're very clear either on what happens with post-plantation land. So as I discuss in my book, Wilted, and that's my book on the strawberry industry, monocultured strawberries may indeed leave land diseased and unusable, but this land would likely not revert to the spaces of agroecological life and refuge that are sometimes imagined in post-plantation accounts. It happens that strawberries and suburbanites are very attracted to similar land in California by the Pacific coast, where the natural air conditioning of the ocean makes it a very pleasant place to live and a very hospitable place to grow strawberries 9 months of the year. So where the strawberry plantations I study go to the way of ruin, say by the work of uncontrollable pathogen outbreaks, which is what's driving the story in my book, or the increasing cost of business, in coastal California, what would flourish in the interstices of the plantation, are sprawling suburbs. And that's a photo of strawberry fields near Oxnard, California. Okay. So my point here is that we can in no way assume that what will arise in the ashes of the plantation are desirable futures. Moreover, it is no longer the case that the primary competing vision to the plantation is an agroecological one. This tech vision is getting a lot of traction. So now I want to turn to my other concern, which is the relation between the ecological conditions of the plantation and its racialized underpinnings. And both revolve on questions, of course, of whose and what lives count. And here I want to think with Craig Hetherington in his fantastic book, Republic of Beans, which in ways resonates with some of my own work on strawberries. As Hetherington writes, cotton and then soy plantations in Paraguay involved multiple ways of killing, both slow and fast violence, removing people from land, both long-term and acute pesticide poisoning of workers, farmers, and surrounding communities, killing important companion species that made other ecologies possible. Roundup in particular, which helped create terra nullius for soy production, especially, not only did that kind of killing, it also eliminated a source of desirable jobs in in cleaning fields. So Hetherington punctuates his analysis with a story of how the eradication of a tribe of hunter-gatherers was labeled genocide, but clearing trees and destroying fauna to make way for the Green Revolution in Paraguay was seen as good, even though it too led to slow death of plants and people. For him, ecocide went hand in hand with genocide. So in Wilted, I show how the strawberry production system involves the killing of soil fungi, which only become pathogens in the context of the annual reintroduction of the host crop, strawberries. This killing exposes nearby workers and residents to toxic chemical fumes. Yet migrant racialized harvest workers rely on fumigation to make a living. Why? Because growers, to maximize productivity and reduce labor costs, pay them on piece rates. So workers actually prefer the more productive plants made possible by poisonous fumigation, and still yet have to work at a breakneck pace to earn a decent hourly wage. And if I was technologically more sophisticated, I'd show you a video of workers working extremely hard, picking those strawberries. And this is all in the name of cheap, nutritious, year-round strawberries for the masses. So here my point is, near brutal labor conditions are going hand in hand with destroying soil microorganisms. And so the point here, and I realize I have not really developed it that well because I only had 10 short minutes, is that the biological simplifications of plantations that concern Haraway and Tsing in their original coining of the term Plantationocene are deeply entwined with the racialized land and labor politics that has concerned other plantation scholarship. To invert a quote of Hetherington, the agro-biopolitical is also the biopolitical. So to be clear, I in no way want to suggest that violence to people has been equivalent to violence to plants and commensurable species or soil fungi. For that matter, I do not want to discount the vitally important critique from Janae Davis and others that scholars in the Black radicals tradition have long been engaging the meanings and legacies of the plantation, far previous to the current conversation. I merely want to suggest that the violence to both racialized humans and to non-human species are often empirically inseparable and therefore arguably analytically inseparable. That's it. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. Our next speaker is Jenny Goldstein, who is a geographer and assistant professor in the Department of Global Development at Cornell. She works in Southeast Asia, mainly Indonesia, on the politics of knowledge in rural development and land restorations. Welcome, Jenny.
Thanks so much, Greg. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So thanks again to Wendy and to the Einaudi Center for organizing us. Like some other previous speakers, I took Wendy's article as a provocation to think about what happens when we shift the Plantationocene concept away from the Atlantic world, centering it instead on the Eastern Indian Ocean with Southeast Asia at its center. So I'm curious about what sorts of histories and actors, relations, and ecologies emerge then, and if they're different from those in the Atlantic world, and in what ways the Plantationocene concept lands awkwardly, potentially, in Asia. So I was thinking about, as I was thinking about the paper and these kinds of questions, I started thinking about a conference I attended in 2016 in Kuching, Malaysia, which is the capital of Sarawak. It was the International Peat Congress. And I'll share a bit about that conference as a way to offer two broad claims here that I, like Julie, won't do justice to in 10 minutes, but I'd like to offer them up for discussion anyway. So the first is that oil palm plantations in particular have produced scientific knowledge of a particular type, that science justifies plantation reproduction through ecological control. So this is to think about the ways that science is, to use Tanya's word from yesterday, engendered by plantations, as much as it produces plantations through rationality. Plantation-supported science is not new, of course, and this is not a far-off phenomenon. Scientific forestry, agricultural technology research have supported plantation development all over the world and for several hundred years. And I think worth mentioning that many colleagues in the Department of Global Development at Cornell do plantation-funded science every day. But what is new, I think, in the contemporary Southeast Asian and particularly Malaysian scientific research context is that it's supported by largely Asian capital, and it frames global concerns, namely climate change, as colonialist, Western, and as a challenge to their own post-colonial sovereignty over their land and economy. So I'd like to also ask if this is a meaningful challenge to the hegemonic Western elite scientific knowledge that we sort of have gotten to know well through the Plantationocene and elsewhere. And if so, is this what we want this challenge to look like? So to think about this, I find work in post-colonial science studies somewhat useful for thinking through this, such as that by Warwick Anderson, Eddie Abraham, a recent piece by Juno Pereñas, who discusses her unease with the concept of indigeneity as it travels to the context of Southeast Asia. And I would bring the same questions to bear on the concept of race, which I'll bring up again at the end. So putting this work from South and Southeast Asian science studies in conversation with the provocation of the Plantationocene reveals that some of these Plantationocene's otherwise, I think, most compelling claims around race and decolonialism don't travel very well to Asia at all, or at least they don't land there very intactly. So we might, I think, to pick up on Nancy Peluso's talk yesterday, think more carefully about what nuanced categories we're using to talk about race in Southeast Asia, but furthermore about the ways that scientific knowledge and new ecological forms are produced through these racialized plantations. So two qualifications here, just based on some good challenges from my panel, fellow panelists this morning. One, I'm focusing on Southeast Asian elites here in this talk. I'm not talking about the rural inhabitants or laborers or those who are most directly impacted by the oil palm plantations' most disastrous effects. I'm really referring here to the scientists, state officials, corporate executives, and managers. Second, I don't mean to say at all that the West or the Atlantic world doesn't matter in Asia. Clearly, the colonial history is very much bound up with the West and with Europe, or that forms of European and Afro-Caribbean plantations don't directly link to Asia. I'd like to offer, I think, instead a more nuanced view to think about the Asian economy, politics, and science in a sort of more regional or even self-contained way, to point out that the view from Asia is a lot more removed from the West and the Atlantic world than many in Europe and North America often think it is, and that these totalizing frameworks, including the Plantationocene, might have us think about the global economy. So to just briefly kind of I guess, advocate for thinking about an Asian-centric oil palm economy. One of the keys to making the Asian Plantationocene possible at this large scale is the role of finance capital, of course. Some of this is from American and European banks, but the vast majority of it comes from Singapore, India, China, Malaysia, and Indonesia, generating great inequality in those countries. Indonesia is the world's largest domestic consumer of palm oil, followed closely by China and India. India, China, and Pakistan together account for more than half of global oil palm imports, with a smaller fraction coming from the US and the EU together. So this is to say that even if the US and the EU were to stop importing oil palm, as many environmental activists have called for through boycotts, it's not that hard to imagine that the global market for oil palm could rely on maintaining and growing consumption throughout Asia itself. And for those that claim, sustainable palm oil schemes offer a, quote, better version of the plantation, which I realize is not many people at this conference, but many people nonetheless, most of the sustainably produced oil palm goes to the EU. There's little demonstrated demand for this in Asian markets. So Indonesia and Malaysia together, as many of you know, produce 85% of the world's palm oil. I can show you a kind of recent map here of the industrial and smallholder plantation extent across Sumatra, Borneo, and peninsular Malaysia. It's really, really extremely vast. And palm oil is now an increasingly common ingredient in most processed foods, cooking oils, cosmetics, biofuels. So while Indonesia produces much more oil palm by volume and has more land incorporated into the Plantationocene, Malaysia, I would argue, is actually the intellectual and financial, quote, capital of Asia's oil palm industry. So particularly relevant to this session on Plantationocene ecologies, much of Indonesia and Malaysia's oil palm is produced on peatlands. Roughly 50% of Southeast Asia's peatlands have been converted to plantations, and together land use on plantations, on peatland-based plantations, contributes to roughly 4% of annual global greenhouse gas emissions, which is really an enormous sum if you think about it. So in very brief, peat is partially decomposed vegetation that's typically submerged underwater. It takes thousands of years to accumulate. You can often see traces of past forests, like here in this photo. But when peat is drained through canals, as it needs to be in order to turn it into plantations, it starts oxidizing and easily catches on fire. So these seemingly neutral facts about the biogeological phenomena are disputed and politicized by the scientific and financial elites that underpin the Malaysian oil palm industry and who have a heavy hand in Indonesia's oil palm industry as well. So really briefly, just to talk about the conference I attended in 2016 and the things that it kind of made me think about. The plenary talks, so I should just say that the world's top leading peatland researchers were at this conference from the US, Australia, from Europe, from all over the world, but they were mostly scheduled, their talks were scheduled in the basement rooms of capacity for about 30 people, with people waiting outside. But meanwhile, the ballrooms, as you can imagine as a conference, that sat 500, had oil palm executives, mostly Malaysian and Malaysian scientists, giving presentations to each other. So it was like there were two parallel conferences going on, with the science in the basement and the industry kind of on a pedestal. This was the first time this Congress was held outside of North America or Europe, so I think it's pretty notable that this is what the first Global South Peat Congress looked like. So the only time these conference participants from these parallel conferences were in direct dialogue was during the opening plenary talks. The chairman and CEO of Ta'an Holdings Berhad, a Malaysian company with subsidiaries in oil palm, gave the introductory keynote. And I quote some of his text here because I think it was really striking to me and remains so now. He started off by describing the company's success in maintaining oil palm plantations on peatlands in Sarawak. He said, quote, "There are allegations from some people that there could be peat soil decomposition, but the level of the soil is not different from before. We need a reality check. The third generation trees are still straight, not leaning." And then he goes on to say, "The NGOs have demonized oil palm. Just look at their history. How far will they go?" He was referring, of course, to European scientists as well, and then proceeded to read a passage about Dutch colonization of the East Indies, including a Javanese massacre by the Dutch. He ended by comparing NGOs, many of whose representatives were in the audience, to a colonizer's army and their knowledge products to weapons of mass destruction. "We can't sink to the level of being subservient to them," he declared, speaking mostly to the Malaysians in the audience. "We have to use real science and technology to face them." So I don't have time to go into detail about the rest of the conference right now, but it was really quite an extraordinary event that, of course, 4 years later, I'm still thinking about. So the things that I've, kind of been thinking about, I guess, in relation to this talk and this material, and I'll skip to the conclusions here, is really, what do we think about plantation ecologies here, right? So most of what justifies the Malaysian and Indonesian plantations on peatland is this non-Western, even anti-Western epistemological project about maintaining peatlands for industrial agricultural production. But defending the scientific research on the part of the Malaysians also entails claims about how peatland-based plantations don't emit significant amounts of carbon, contrary to consensus knowledge, and thus are not significant contributors to climate change. So in this case, decolonialism and anti-Westernization go hand in hand. The Malaysians and the Indonesian oil palm industry often uses nationalist rhetoric to justify their plantation expansion, and they see any international attempts to appeal to a global atmospheric commons as a threat to their sovereignty and national economies. So the specter of colonialism, in other words, I think is very much present in the Asian Plantationocene. But more broadly, as green neoliberal conservation, international cooperation, and climate change mitigation is the form of colonialism that the Southeast Asians see. And just to wrap up in brief, there's several, I think, awkward points that bringing the Plantationocene into this context in Southeast Asia kind of gives rise to. And I think the first is the Western concept with conceptual material roots, as Jarvis really eloquently talked about in the Atlantic and Afro-Caribbean. We can't transpose those conceptions of Western racial capitalism on Southeast Asia, as others have noted. Many of these racial hierarchies have been reproduced in Southeast Asia through the plantation, but they look different, right? In Malaysia, it manifests through Chinese Malaysian capital that supports corporate elites, whereas South Asians and indigenous people are often the laborers. But those racial categories don't even travel well to Indonesia, where Chinese Indonesians are often marginalized, but Javanese Muslims are privileged, often in plantation economies. And finally, we can look at how land itself, through this case of the peatlands, not just plants and crops, need to be maintained and kept intact in the Plantationocene, or it might actually disappear entirely. So what is keeping peatland intact for the Plantationocene is, I think, this mutually reinforcing relationship between financial capital and scientific research, between investors, CEOs, and scientists, and the ways that the plantation has actually produced certain types of science and ecologies for its own plantation reproduction. So I'll end there. Thank you again.
Our next speaker is Tsing, who teaches anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her most recent collaborative project is Feral Atlas, the More Than Human Anthropocene, a transdisciplinary digital book, which I encourage you all to check out at feralatlas.org. So Anna, welcome.
Thank you, Greg, and also thank you to Wendy and all the organizers of this conference. Why do we use the term plantation to discuss the ecological effects of contemporary agribusiness? To me, the reason is to explore connections with European colonial exploitation in the Americas and the global South, and particularly its legacies of coerced labor. By coerced labor, I refer not only to enslaved people kidnapped from Africa, but also to the many plantation workers across European colonies forced to work because of colonial coercions, from head taxes to transport contracts to outright displacement. Of course, all of those plantation workers had considerable knowledge about plants. For example, John Rashford has shown the impressive botanical knowledge of enslaved Africans in the Americas. Many scholars, including Janae Davis and colleagues, have called attention to multi-species gardens. But plantation owners did not care a bit about this knowledge and instead designed plantation agriculture for owners' stereotypes of coerced labor. Plantation owners created simplified and disciplined ecologies because they believed this was the way to effectively use coerced labor. Simplified ecologies were designed to require no knowledge or care on the part of workers. Having only one kind of crop and one schedule of ripening was supposed to make agriculture using coerced labor possible, since farmers did not need to attend to the variety of temporalities of a multi-species field. Again, never mind the realities of plantation workers' knowledge and ability. The monocrop agricultural enterprise has its roots in owners' assumptions about coerced labor. When machines were introduced to further simplify agribusiness ecologies, they replaced not generic human labor, but coerced labor as imagined by plantation owners. That is, labor that only allowed focus on one thing at a time. Thus, machine-heavy agribusiness today continues the legacy of coerced labor in building ecological simplification into farming. I go through this logic because there's been considerable controversy about the term Plantationocene, and some scholars have argued that the term itself signals an insensitivity to racial injustice. And yet the plantation condition practically invented racial injustice as well as a whole wing of environmental disaster. It's this combination that makes thinking through the plantation good for understanding how to work on questions of race and the environment together. David Pello has recently argued that state violence requires our attention to both humans and non-humans. Which are connected through a logic in which people of color, as well as plants and animals, are regarded as dispensable. In my 10 minutes with you, I follow his lead to consider the logics of racial capitalism as it shapes the plantation condition. Consider these potential principles, which each link racial injustice and environmental harm. First, the purification of plantation crops makes them ever more dangerous. Second, the profligate use of poisons singles out workers and local residents as pests. Each of these suggests how the still segregated human condition is created together with the more than human condition by the material logics of the plantation. Let me explain each of these calls to action through scholarship from my recently published collaborative digital book, Feral Atlas, available at feralatlas.org. The atlas documents the social and ecological dynamics of non-humans incited by human activity, but outside human control. There's a lot about the plantation condition. What I'll present is a tiny sliver. In what follows, I'll follow the lead of two other BIPOC scholars, that means Black, Indigenous, and people of color, who respectively guide me through racial logics of the plantation condition. And it turns out that both of them are here at this conference. Thank you for your work, and if I misrepresent it, please correct me in the chat. 1, the purification of plantation crops makes them ever more dangerous. This is because monocrops amass pathogens, and this hurts humans and non-humans. Latina agroecologist Yvette Perfecto wrote for Feral Atlas about coffee plantations in Latin America and their vulnerability to plant-destroying coffee rust fungus. This map shows the spread of the rust from its native place, as well as that of coffee in northeastern Africa. The rust has light spores blown in the wind, but they fail to cause an epidemic when trees are grown in shady polyculture, as they are among smallholders in much of Latin America. Peasant coffee protected the region against rust until the end of the 20th century, when full-sun monoculture moved in. Rust gathered in those plantations. In 2012, the rust killed 90% of the plants. Worse yet, it did not just kill the monocrop fields. It also killed the peasant crops in their shady polycultures. Once enough rust had gathered in the plantations, it spread out across the countryside, far beyond plantation boundaries. Monocrops draw plantations, and they don't just sit inside the plantation fence. They spread around the countryside, and once conjured, it's very, very difficult to get them to go away. If killing the livelihoods of smallholders counts as a dangerous human effect, coffee plantations are dangerous to humans as well as their coffee plants. And this is a racial logic because of the dispensability of smallholders from the perspective of coffee companies. Monoculture plantations don't just amass pathogens, they also provide them fertile grounds for mutations. The effect is related to what we've seen with human crowds and the coronavirus. New variants are sometimes more virulent. More importantly, they're more likely to hop to other species. Consider the fungus Candida auris, which was a benign soil fungus until it became collateral damage in fields bombarded with fungicides. As a result, it developed superpowers, that is, resistance against fungicides. When it moved into hospitals with these new superpowers, no one could get rid of it, and it made the hospital experience even more dangerous than it was before. This graph shows amounts of fungicides poured on U.S. farms between 1996 and 2017. Massive fungicide use creates deadly fungal pathogens. The purification of plantation crops makes them ever more dangerous. I've already traveled close to my second point, the prolific use of poisons singles out workers and local residents as pests. Let me follow Filipino-American anthropologist Alyssa Paredes there. In her article for Feral Atlas, she describes the use of cocktails of fungicides sprayed on banana plantations in the Philippines. It's very difficult for scientists or activists to document the effect of these fungicides because the mixtures are both unresearched and never announced. But local people report terrifying effects on themselves, their children, and their chickens, and their gardens. As shown in this photograph, protesters said, "I am not a pest." The racial logic should be clear. By using an uncontainable form of fungicide application, banana companies have made it clear that the lives of people, their animals, and their gardens are disposable. Just as fungi in the soil, whether helpful or not, are disposable. In aiming for one enemy, the banana companies have declared the rest of human and non-human life collateral damage, not worth protecting. Meanwhile, Paredes explains that some banana companies have organized counter-demonstrations, getting their workers out in the street to chant, "Jobs, not the environment." Here's that unhelpful dichotomy. Either we want social justice or we want a living environment. Here, this is the story plantation companies want to tell. When we adopt it in our scholarship and our activism, we're in trouble. My commitment to trying to explain more than human plantation life through its racial logics emerges in part because a few scholars of racial justice have objected to projects in which I played a part. I think I understand their frustration, which I believe goes beyond badly used words. They've spent so much effort opening the concept of the human, which has so often excluded people of color. It may seem excessive, perhaps even insulting, to worry about non-humans when the task of creating a better humanism is not complete. I apologize for my part in causing harm. Working across struggles for social justice and against environmental devastation is still new terrain, and it's a learning process in which all of us must develop new words and forms. Meanwhile, let me say that I'm delighted by the burst of new work by BIPOC scholars working as I am to explore how racial justice and environmental destruction are intertwined. Joshua Bennett's new book, for example, starts with the pitfalls of comparisons between Black people and animals to argue that we must go through those parallels to look for the animal as promise of another possible world. This requires an empathetic relation, he argues, in which animals are unlikely allies. This brings him into potential touching distance with the insights of Native American scholars, from botanist Robin Kimmerer to social theorist Kyle White, who patiently explain that plants and animals are our kin, and that if we destroy them, we destroy ourselves too. There's new work, too, at the intersection of BIPOC legacies. The Sluicers, for example, is a group of women of color across racial distinctions working to shorten the Anthropocene and the Plantationocene. We've written 2 articles together so far, with more to come. Here's the promise of working on race and environment together. I think it can be done. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Anna. Our final speaker before we open up to conversation is Sérgio Sauer, who holds a PhD in sociology and is a professor in the Center for Sustainable Development at the University of Brasilia. His research focuses on land grabbing, land struggles, and agrarian social movements. Welcome, Sérgio.
Thank you, Greg. Is my mic on? Yeah. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, my previous colleagues in this panel. It's really good to hear your thoughts and also thanks Wendy for organizing this conference. I'm following since yesterday and it has been really remarkable. Thanks for bringing us together for this discussion. I will try to. The problem is that I'm not seeing you, but anyway. Quickly, 3 initial remarks. First of all, I didn't write down my thoughts and ideas. I know it will save some time, but I don't have the discipline to organize previously. So it will be some sharing with you some general thoughts about our plantation and Plantationocene in Brazil. Second, I will try to avoid to get into a conjecture or today's analysis, what is going on in Brazil, not only because Judith did a great job in the previous panel, but also because our reality Brazilian pandemic situation is so chaotic, totally almost unbearable. So it'll be difficult to organize my thoughts in around that, what's going on around here these days. And clearly it's a genocide. So I will leave that for now. And third, like my previous colleagues, I also kind of draw some ideas out from Wendy's paper, particularly the fact that she based her discussion on Luso-tropical contribution. And since Brazil probably is more tropical than Luso, I will kind of only add some data to kind of corroborate and sustain Wendy's arguments in terms of the Plantationocene. But I will take only 2 aspects, racism and inequality. Probably I'm not the best person being, having a European background to talk about races, but I want to bring some data from 2017 agriculture and livestock census, because it was the first time that Brazil include in the research a relation or ask the farmers how they declare themselves as Black or white or brown or indigenous. So race and color for the first time was included in this census, and it shows how deep our social and historical inequality is in this country. Okay, but I will start the first slides because I was provoked by some of the discussion yesterday. I think it was Tanya Lee that asked why the plantation still continues to be seen as a savior. I don't know about the other countries, Asia in particular, but I know about Brazil, and that's the first one of the answers. There's this media campaign by Rede Globo. It's one of the largest TV network in the Americas, in Brazil and Latin America for sure. And they had this, I don't know, it's running for a couple years, this slogan saying the agro or the agri or the rural is tech, the agro is pop, the agro is everything. And there's a whole bunch of commercials, propaganda, literally propaganda, putting up all these great things that why the agro is so pop and tech. So that's one reason why in countries like Brazil, plantation is still so important. Okay, going back to to put some historical ground, what I'm trying to point out in this is the next slides in terms of racism and inequality in the countryside, Brazilian countryside. It's important to remember that it's a country that, according to some scholars, first imprisoned the land in 1850 with this Land Act, saying that people only would have access to land if they would buy or purchase from the government. Thirdly, almost 40 years later, the abolition of slavery. So some scholars say that to implement capitalism in Brazil, first they imprison the land under capital streams, and then free the slaves. So the black people couldn't access land from then on. 1 year after the abolition, in 1889, the new president just burned all the documents and records of the slavery period, because he said that our past should be forgotten. So, and since the Seis Maria system, colonial period, brought from Portugal through this Land Act into the Green Revolution, which was implemented in Brazil after 1964. It came earlier, a little bit earlier, but it was really implemented as governmental policies for modernization of agriculture. All this period, it's what I call a long history of discrimination, racism, and inequality in the countryside. And it results in this. It's very well known, so I'm not gonna go through all of it, only to show you that this is a deep land concentration. So the small farms under 10 hectares are almost half of the farms, and they hold only 2.3% of the land. The farms above 1,000 hectares, they are less than 1% of the farms, and they hold almost 45% of the whole land. But that's in general terms. That'll be a figure how it works, right? The lines are the farms and the bars are the land. But I want to bring that in the case of race, and that's really astonishing. So this 2017 agricultural census figure out, or that 2.6 million farmers declare themselves blacks, and 2.3 million declare themselves white. So almost half and a half, but with more people declare themselves blacks. Then I put that related to some of the production, some of the plantation, right? First, soy producers, only 9.6% declare themselves blacks, and 88% declare themselves white. Sugar, 39, 54, and coffee producers, 32 declare themselves black, and 66 declare themselves white. I'm just going to go to the last two. This I have in Portuguese, but just want to show you how the distribution of land among blacks and whites, okay? Here on the left is in Portuguese, but mainly is the size of the farms. So until 20 hectares, it's kind of from 10 to 20 hectares is 42% are black and 54 are white. And from then up goes to white and white and white and white until farms over 10,000 hectares in several states, there's no owners that declare themselves Black. So what I'm trying to say with all these figures, sorry, I'm rushing through this data, is that land concentration in Brazil, it's a historical process, but when we divide or separate between those that declare themselves Blacks and those that declare themselves whites, it's even deeper, the inequality and land ownership. But just to getting to the end, and that will leave things for the discussion. Our themes is after Plantationocene. I'm not going to talking about after, because I'm usually too apocalyptic in my analysis. So I'm not going to end it with a hopeless vision, but I want to mention one thing that has been also part of Brazilian history, particularly after 1980s, that is land struggle. And here I am talking about a struggle that is not reduced to land occupation, okay? So that includes landless peasants, indigenous groups, maroon communities, and so on. So in the last 3 or 4 decades, there was victories, if not out of Plantationocene, but at least some victories related to settlements, conservation unit, what is environment is involved, or saving, preserving nature of sustainable use, indigenous land, maroon communities, or Afro-Brazilian descendants territories. Altogether is almost 25% of the Brazilian land. This is the map that are the conservation units, settlements, all spread, particularly in the Amazon. The largest territories are in the Amazon, but they are spread all over the country. I don't think it's after plantation, but it's a sort of so I'm trying to go back here. I'm back. Some signs that conquer territory that goes beyond plantation. To finish, sorry, Greg, I couldn't see you because the slides was taking all over my thing. So I think my time is already over. I just want to conclude with one question. Pierre Bourdieu, a social and anthropologist, French anthropologist, said that social science deals with named and classified realities. So my question is, what are the political, ecological, and scientific implications of naming our reality Plantationocene? Not plantation, Plantationocene. And I'm saying that because we don't have this word in Portuguese. But for us in Portuguese, plantation, plantação, it doesn't have the same meaning. It's a literal translation, but doesn't have the same meaning. It's if you're gardening back in the backyard of house, you can say, this is my plantação, okay? So that's the question. And related to that, using that naming reality as a Plantationocene, does it mean that we putting back or poison back land and nature in the center of our social and political analysis? Thank you for now. Sorry for taking that long.
No problem. Thank you so much, Sergio. And thanks to all the speakers for really such a rich conversation, so many directions we could go. So now the floor is open to questions, either by through the raise hand function, or you can post in chat. There's already been an extensive question and series of questions, many of which I think have been answered in the chat. The one that from far back, but which I'll start with, I think is directed mostly at Rachel's talk, but I think it actually opens up a larger question, which a lot of the panelists have spoke about, around the politics of repair and reparations in a way. And this is from Haider Khan, who says the neoliberal turn in Africa definitely exacerbated food insecurity. But the Green Revolution predated structural adjustment programs and was already leading towards concentration and centralization and long-term ecological unsustainability. What kind of policy space do African countries have today to reverse the dominant neoliberal tendencies and policy structures?
I can take a brief stab at that, but that's a big question. I think there's limited space, I think, except that there has been a call for more investment in agriculture, in smallholder agriculture, and in agriculture more broadly, starting with the World Bank report, really, in the 2000s. But that call has been ongoing. Whether that is a turn away from industrial agriculture, industrial style agriculture, is a different question. But there are some African governments that are promoting alternative approaches to agriculture. Senegal, for example, has a policy on agroecology, but by and large, the push and the policy space for agriculture in terms of neoliberalism is, I mean, it's mainly the push in the policy space is investment in agriculture, but investment in industrial model agriculture. So linking farmers more to markets, linking them to fertilizer and hybrid seed and genetically modified seed and pesticides, and digital agriculture and all of that. So really not much of an opening for alternatives to that model. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'll turn now to, I think Rob Davenport was the first in the group of raised hands.
This is a question for Sérgio. Sérgio, muito obrigado pela sua apresentação. Thanks everyone for this great conference. And I'm in Brazil, so forgive me for asking a very particular question, given the disaster that we're in terms of agribusiness and continued promotion, sort of marginalization of smallholder agriculture. Sérgio, I was wondering if you might, in the Amazon, there's a lot of obviously interest in saving the rainforest, but I've noticed something that it involves a kind of favoritism towards big landowners, white landowners, in terms of the way that conservation policy approaches the problem. And I'm wondering, because of the presence of the MSAT in this conference, and one of the wonderful things that the landless movement's been able to do in the Southeast and the Northeast, the presence of the MSAT in the Amazon is rather limited. And I know you're in Anapu, you have some things in southern Pará, southeastern Pará, but it's the kind of invisibility of the diversity of smallholding farmers in the Brazilian Amazon is something I was wondering if you've noticed in terms of just the way that the politics of that region play out, and also the kind of way that the politics of appropriating land with cattle at 5,000 hectares at a time is part of this plantation conversation. I don't know if you have a comment on that. Thank you.
Should I jump in, Greg, or collect more questions?
Please, absolutely.
Okay. I two comments. One related to reparation, or I think for our experience, I think there is at least 2 or 3 measures that we should push for. One, of course, out from our Brazilian reality, one is that we need urgently change the course of land use. Brazilian agriculture frontier is still growing. There is a lot of concerns about the Amazon, like myself, but Cerrado biome is also being really, really affected by this spread, the expansion of agriculture frontier, with thousands of hectares of the forest being turned down every year for cultivating, particularly soya, but also raising cattle, right? So that's one that we need to change drastically. So, really slow down the speed how they are turning down the forest, particularly in Cerrado biome, but also in the Amazon. Secondly, it has been, at least for a decade, that agroecology and ecological or biological cultivation, it's a way that we should move on for more sustainable production, but also for healthy food. Third, the MST last year launched a campaign. I don't know how to translate better, but something like 1 million trees for sustainable lives among the poor or among the landless peasants. So they decided to plant 1 tree for every family. Around 1 million families are being benefited by the former land reform program. So that would be also something that we need to move on. And the fourth, it's a permanent struggle in countries, tropical countries like Brazil, with rich biodiversity, is to enforce the laws, conservation laws related to the Amazon, but also to the other biomes. So that's a way that would respond quickly to this matter of reparation. Related to the MST, we need more time to explain. I don't have the full answer, but one reason is that MST was not originally created in the Amazon. It was, organized in the south and moved to São Paulo state and to the northeast, the central Brazil. And so that's one reason. Second, there is particularities in called the peasants, or the people that live in the countryside, particularly in the Amazon. The kind of agriculture is combined with other productive activities like extractivism and so on. So it's a different way how they use and produce in daily basis, culturally speaking. So that's one reason I think that MST has trouble getting more organized in the Amazon region. Third, you mentioned Pará, but there is also groups in Rondônia state, but it are a state that has a southern farmers influence, because a lot of landless peasants moved during 70s and 80s into the Amazon for decolonization projects. And MST is kind of more organized there. Being critical to that, I would say probably is because only recently the MST and other peasants movements in Brazil start to be more aware the nature and environment needs to be addressed, also related to land and land struggle. That's probably one of the reasons, more political or cultural reason why MST has trouble to be more organized in the Amazon. And the last one is that the Amazon, because of the historical struggle in terms of rob tappers, extractive activities or extractive groups, indigenous struggle, there is other social movements, not necessarily agrarian movements, that are very active in the Amazon than sort of cover, politically speaking, a movement like the MST, I would say. Okay, that's for now.
So we have a question that's come in from all the panelists, and it would be good to get everybody involved in the conversation. And the question is from Uli Moreno, and they ask, do you find any links between plantation ecologies and your understandings of infrastructure? So I don't know who wants to first tackle that. Anna, please. And then Jenny.
Okay. For me, a useful way to hang on to the materiality that's part of that word, infrastructure, is to expand the word to talk about all kinds of projects of transforming the land and the water and the air. And in that case, the plantation is an infrastructure, and it's one of the most important earth-altering infrastructures that we have. And for me, that's a productive stretch of the term infrastructure, because it allows us to think about both its intended consequences and all of the other things that come along with infrastructure building that we don't pay attention to, the ways that it creates edges and ruins and lots of more things than what's been intended. So I would like to expand the notion of infrastructure to include the plantation.
Yeah, I can, I guess, briefly talk about that. I was thinking about that a lot during this conference. So, I mean, in the context where I work, which is in these peatlands, which have been really sort of set into disrepair on a scale that I think is hard to imagine. We're talking about up to 10 million hectares of lands that just no longer ecologically or hydrologically functions as it's supposed to. And I think I don't know how to think about resistance, I think, in the context of that type of infrastructural damage, because, you know, these sort of I think things that people that are really valuable contributions to the plantation conversation around shifting more to smallholders or to agroecology in the peatlands that are in disrepair just doesn't make sense from a scalar perspective, right? There's a really massive scalar mismatch between the sorts of infrastructural interventions of repair that are needed and the damage that has already been done. So, I mean, from, you know, again, where I sit, it's hard to imagine those sorts of infrastructural interventions that could maybe in the long term do some sort of good for the planet, for the people there, to not involve, say, the corporations and the state, right, at very large scales. I just haven't seen any sort of small interventions on a more human, individual humanized scale really work in the peatlands in terms of infrastructure. So.
Yeah, so I'm going to take this question in a completely different direction, and that is to think about the relationship between the ecology and infrastructure in these tech visions. Because, you know, the fantasy here is that if you can completely contain the production of food in bioreactors or greenhouses, that you can keep out all the ecological problems of the world. Of course, it's a conceit, because you can't, but that's the conceit. And indeed, not only do you need to literally contain the growth of food through microorganisms or what have you, but you also have to use all sorts of light and temperature control to override the temporalities of food production in soil and in sun, et cetera, and in rain. Yet another contradiction of this vision is that there's a claim that this is going to dematerialize food production, that we're not going to have to mess up the world with plantations or with farming or whatever. And yet there's no talk about the extraordinary infrastructure that it would take to scale up to produce food this way. And, you know, and a much kind of more invasive, in some sense, infrastructure than even what we might see in farming with the bioreactors, et cetera, and the extraordinary use of energy for light and temperature control.
Okay, we have a lot more questions. Yeah, Sergio, quickly.
Quickly,
we can get,
yeah. In our cases, Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, I have to remember plantation is basically from colonial period up to today is based on for exporting. So building infrastructure is crucial, is key for to keep the plantation, right? So even recently, the progressive governments in Brazil, in Bolivia, in Argentina had mass investments of public resources to build roads, ports, and then two quick cases, concrete cases. Cargill built a huge port in the heart of the Amazon. So there was one reason to spread the soya cultivation into the Amazon. So there is a really tight, if you think plantation in terms of monocrops for export, it's key, it's crucial. And second, now we are struggling against Chinese investment in the same region into the Amazon to build around 1,000 kilometers a railroad to take out soya from Mato Grosso and Pará into this Cargill port and then shipped to China. So I think in modern terms, or even in colonial period, it's not possible to talk about plantation if you don't talk about public investments in infrastructure.
Great, thank you. I know Maddie's been waiting a long time with the question, so please.
I apologize if the question's a bit simple. I am a baby undergraduate geographer here, and so I'm going to try to put it succinctly as well in a way that makes me sound a little bit smarter than maybe I am right now. But I believe it was Julie who mentioned earlier, and I'm sure that this is reflective in all of your research as well, the combination of analyzing ecological damages within plantations as well, alongside of cultural denigration of African slaves as well as later African descendants within these varying regions. And I'm wondering how a combination of that analysis can propagate that subhuman rhetoric between the two subjects of analysis.
Thank you. Anyone want to tackle that?
I don't know that, I mean, you directed it kind of to me. I don't know that I can answer that in any quick fashion. I mean, for me, the relationship between ecological reworkings and how racialized labor is put to work, as it were, is always kind of an empirical question. And, you know, the cultural denigration is part of what happens to racialized labor. I'm teaching a class on California right now, which I love to teach, and we use a book by Tomas Almaguer, Racial Fault Lines. And he talks about that in very much in California's early history, about how, the kind of discursive and cultural ways in which various peoples who came to California were discussed, or indigenous people were discussed as a way to insert them into different kind of labor slots. So it's always geographically specific. So it's always, and historically specific. So it's always an empirical question how that happens. That's my best way of answering that off the top of my head.
Thank you. Great. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're past time. Please really join me in thanking our panelists for such careful and thoughtful and compassionate presentations. Also, thanks to all of you in the audience that have been so generative with your questions and conversations in the chat. And thank you to Wendy and all the people working behind the scenes at Cornell that has made this possible. So it's been a great pleasure, and thank you all.